That day, the mountains weren't just silent, they held their breath, like a predator about to pounce, and Alexei realized that no one would emerge from this gorge alive. The booming bang of the first shot shattered the silence, and the armored personnel carrier driving ahead instantly turned into a flaming iron coffin. The gravel beneath their feet turned a sticky, heavy crimson, and the air filled with the acrid smell of burnt rubber and alien death. Alexei, a GRU Special Forces captain with the call sign Granite, lay pressed against the icy crushed stones, feeling the shriek of red-hot lead pierce the space centimeters above his head. Beside him, Seryoga, his best friend and deputy platoon commander, wheezed, trying to press his hand against the hole in his side through which life was escaping in spurts. All around them, hell raged. Screams, curses, random gunfire, and the monotonous, maddening sound of a machine gun firing from the green area. "Go away, Lyoka," Seryoga croaked, spitting thick blood onto the dusty collar of his Afghan jacket. "Pull our men. I'll cover them." But there was no one left to pull. 5 soldiers lay motionless, their faces buried in the sharp rocks, while the rest were cut off by a wall of fire. Alexei pulled the pin on a grenade, feeling the GRU man's cold calculation displace the horror. He knew that, by all the laws of tactics, in a minute they would be surrounded and cut down. The captain's gaze met his friend's glassy eyes, which no longer held fear, only the endless, bottomless weariness of a man who had fulfilled his duty to the end. The encirclement was tightening, and the only escape route was a sheer cliff, shrouded in gray smoke, and the death groans of his platoon. The first stars lit up the sky, cold and indifferent to the fact that below, in the shadow of the Hindu Kush, the story of an entire unit had just ended, and the story of a ghost had just begun. The rock cut his fingers like broken glass, but Alexei felt no pain, only the animalistic rhythm of survival vibrating through his veins. He crawled upward, pressing into every crack, while below, the Dushmans methodically finished off the wounded. Single shots sounded like the dry cracks of a whip, and after each sound, something inside the captain finally snapped, turning to cold ash. He heard their guttural cries, their triumphant laughter, and the scent of victory that always smells the same of gunpowder and iron. Having reached the narrow ledge, Alexei froze, a gray shadow against the rocks. His left hand was covered in blood, not his own, but Sergina's, and the blood had already begun to dry, tightening the skin in a death grip. From above, the gorge seemed like a black maw swallowing his life, his men, and his past. A notebook containing a list of the boys' home addresses weighed heavily in his uniform pocket. He'd promised to burn it if the worst came to the worst. But he had no hands. One was clutching the ledge, the other clutching the handle of his knife, because the machine gun remained down there, jammed and useless. Night fell suddenly, bringing with it an icy wind that cut right through his sweat-soaked cotton. He knew they would search for him. A GRU agent was a valuable trophy, alive or dead, and Granite was worth an entire village. Alexei closed his eyes and for a moment saw a suburban commuter train, the scent of lilacs, and his mother pouring tea into old faceted glasses. The hallucination vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving behind only the taste of granite dust on his lips. Now he was alone, hundreds of kilometers into hostile territory, without a radio, without water, with only one grenade, and an unbearable burden of survivor's guilt that weighed heavier than the mountains above. The first night of his long journey from the dead had begun. The descent down the other side of the ridge took an eternity. Every movement sent a dull, excruciating ache through his back, but Alexei moved mechanically, like a clockwork metronome. He reached a dry stream bed just as the eastern sky began to fill with a dirty, grayish light. The thirst became palpable, it swelled his tongue and scraped the inside of his throat like sandpaper. He found a small puddle, shrouded in a murky film, and drank from it, forcing the water through his teeth to avoid swallowing maggots and sand. At that moment, he heard a sound. It wasn't wind or crumbling rock. Far below, in the haze of pre-dawn fog, a diesel engine rumbled. Alexei pressed himself into a crevice, shielding his face with a dirty hand to keep his skin from glaring in the light. A convoy moved past, along a barely visible trail. 3 pickup trucks with machine guns mounted in the back and an old truck hung with jerrycans. The sides bore unfamiliar markings, but the captain recognized from the bearing of the men in the back that this wasn't just a gang of spirits, but a caravan of mercenaries, and they were moving professionally, combing every sector. Alexei felt the last F1 grenade in his pocket. Its pin was already slightly bent. He knew that for his people, he was either dead or missing in action, and in the Soviet Union of 1985, that was sometimes worse than death. A ghost, he thought to himself. If he went out to them now, they'd buy or sell him. If he stayed here, the mountains would eat his flesh within a week. But the professional instincts of a GRU officer told him otherwise. This caravan was heading for a secret pass base, unknown to the district's intelligence service. This was a chance not just to survive, but to take with him to the next world as many of those who had left his men to rot in the gorge as possible. He began to descend after the column, transforming from prey to hunter, with nothing left but rage and cold calculation. The caravan moved slowly, carefully avoiding dangerous areas. Alexei followed parallel to the trail, taking advantage of the folds of the terrain and the long shadows cast by the cliffs at dawn. Every step was laborious. His Adidas sneakers, so beloved by the special forces for their quietness, slipped on the fine pebbles. His stomach ached with hunger, and dark spots swam before his eyes, but his brain continued to register details. The number of guns, the frequency of stops, the manner in which the radio operators acquired the frequency. By midday, the column had entered the deep square of an abandoned village, hidden in the folds of the plateau. This place wasn't listed on the maps of the 40th Army headquarters. Among the dilapidated adobe walls, new camouflage nets and satellite antennas were visible technology that ordinary mujahideen couldn't possibly possess. Alexei lay down 500 meters above, behind a rocky outcrop. He saw boxes labeled in English being unloaded from a truck. The captain's heart began to pound. This was a major supply hub, a hornet's nest that fed the entire force in this sector. Suddenly, the door of one of the buildings opened, and a man in camouflage, without insignia, but with the distinctive bearing of a career officer, stepped out. He ordered his guards in perfect English, and they rushed to obey. Alexei realized he was in the epicenter of a grand game, where his life was merely a nuisance. A plan, insane and suicidal, formed in his head. He had no ammunition, but he knew sabotage tactics and knew that the village was going to be blown up that night. He began to slowly crawl closer, trying not to think about the fact that back home, in the village outside Moscow, his mother had probably already received a death notice or a missing person notice. And this thought burned him more than the Afghan sun. Alexei's shadow blended with the scorched earth as he slipped into the dead zone beyond the village's outermost wall. The air here was stagnant, smelling of manure, old dust, and something sickly sweet, the scent of raw opium, the main commodity of this accursed war. The captain froze, his back pressed against the rough clay, and caught his breath. His heart pounded against his ribs, but his hands remained icy. He saw the sentry, a young man in a Pashtun jacket, his English rifle casually slung over his shoulder. The sentry yawned, unaware that death was already staring him in the back of the head. The lunge was instantaneous and silent, honed by years of training in the GRU boot camp. Alexei's hand clamped tightly over the militant's mouth, and the knife, drawn from its sheath, sank precisely under the base of his skull. The body went limp in his arms, and the captain carefully lowered it to the ground, careful not to disturb the empty tin cans arranged along the wall like a crude alarm system. Now he had a carbine, and to spare magazines a meager arsenal, but enough for a professional to wreak havoc. He made his way to the shed, where, judging by the smell of diesel fuel and the stacks of crates, a fuel and ammunition depot was located. Inside, in the semi-darkness, zinc boxes of ammunition and mines gleamed dimly. Alexei felt almost physically sick at the realization of how many such mines would soon end up under the wheels of our convoys on Salam. He began methodically opening the crates, removing the detonators. The plan was simple. Connect the detonators into a single circuit using scraps of telephone wire found in the corner. But at that moment, the door creaked. The same mercenary officer, dressed in camouflage, stood at the threshold, clutching a mug of steaming coffee. Their eyes met. One professional recognized the other in an instant, and the cup, spinning slowly in the air, fell to the floor. The cup shattered with a dry clang, the sound signaling the beginning of the dance with death. The mercenary lunged for his holster, but Alexei was faster. He didn't fire, so as not to give himself away prematurely, but instead swung the butt of his captured carbine. The crunch of his jaw was drowned out by the booming echoes of the barn. The officer collapsed, bleeding profusely, but managed to press the button on the radio slung over his shoulder. A sharp, guttural shout from outside cut through the hissing radio. There was no more time for manual mining. Alexei snatched tornado grenades from the belt of the fallen enemy and yanked the pins. He stuffed them into an open box of mortar propellant charges, covering them with a heavy tarpaulin. It was a trap for anyone who ran inside. The captain jumped out the back window, smashing the flimsy frame with his shoulder, and rolled across the dusty ground as the first, not yet main, explosion rang out behind him. The village instantly came alive, turning into a disturbed anthill. Shouts in Pashto mingled with commands in English, flares soared into the sky, bathing the ruins in a deathly white light. Alexei ran in the shadow of the duel, feeling the adrenaline burn away the last of his fatigue. He needed to reach the fuel truck parked in the center of the yard. If it caught fire, the chain reaction would turn the place into a lake of fire. A burst of machine gun fire hit him in the back, and wood chips from the door sprayed into his face, cutting his cheek. The captain fell, rolled, and fired his carbine point-blank at the silhouette at the entrance, feeling the familiar recoil pound his shoulder, returning him to the only state where he was truly a god, or the state of battle. It wasn't his life at stake, but those tons of death that weren't supposed to escape this nest to Salam. The truck roared as bullets ripped through its sides, sending a stream of diesel fuel gushing from the punctured canisters onto the scorching ground. Alexei raised his rifle, aiming for the gas tank, but at that moment the ground beneath his feet shook. The very ammunition depot he'd rigged with grenades had finally detonated for real. A mushroom cloud of fire shot up into the black sky, shattering the adobe walls of the barn like a house of cards. The shock waved through the captain to the ground, knocking the air from his lungs, as a hail of rubble and burning tarpaulin rained down from above. The ringing in his ears drowned out all sound, leaving only a thin, piercing squeak. Alexei raised his head. The village had become a branch of hell. Secondary detonations flared, tearing the night with flashes of orange and crimson. The surviving mercenaries scrambled in panic, trying to salvage any remaining equipment, but the fire had already spread to the second truck. The captain staggered to his feet, feeling warm blood trickle down his face from his cut forehead. He looked like someone from the dead, dusted, bloodied, with a mad gleam in his eyes. 10 meters away, the same English-speaking officer tumbled out of the clouds of smoke. His face was a bloody mess, one hand hanging limply, but in the other he clutched a heavy Browning. They stood frozen against each other against the raging flames. No words were needed. It was a duel between two shadows, two dogs of war, whose countries were not officially at war here. The mercenary raised his pistol, but his fingers trembled, perhaps from concussion, or perhaps from a primal fear of this Russian who had risen from the ashes of their own trap. Alexei pulled the trigger on the carbine, but instead of a shot he heard only a dry click. He was out of ammunition. The mercenary grinned crookedly, spitting thick blood, and slowly began to straighten his arm holding the heavy barrel. A triumphant glimmer blazed in his pain-shrouded eyes. He knew this round was his. Alexei felt time slow down, turning into a viscous jelly. He saw his enemy's finger on the trigger, saw the soot on his camouflage, and heard another wall crumble behind him. Death stood a step away, icy and inevitable, like a winter dawn outside Moscow. A downward thrust of the knife was the Special Forces soldier's final argument, his lead taken from him. The steel sank under the mercenary's chin with a wet, squelching sound, cutting off his triumphant sigh. The officer dropped his pistol, his fingers clutching Alexei's sleeve, leaving crimson streaks on the faded fabric of his Afghan jacket. They collapsed together, victor and vanquished, rolling in the hot dust until life finally left the enemy's body. The captain pushed the corpse away, breathing heavily, feeling his lungs torn by the smoke. The village buzzed like a disturbed beehive into which a torch had been thrown. The fire reached the fuel tanks, and a deafening explosion sent the multi-ton skeleton of a truck flying into the air. The flash momentarily blinded Alexei, turning the night into a blinding white day. He had to leave before the surviving militants came to their senses and blocked the only exit through the gorge. He picked up the mercenary's Browning and checked the magazine 3 rounds. Only 3 chances to return to his people or put an end to this story without embarrassing himself in front of Seryoga and the boys left there on the nameless stones. He dove into the thick smoke, turning into an invisible ghost, escaping the jaws of the awakening hell. Smoke stung his eyes, turning the world into a gray, swaying mass. Alexei groped, navigating by the heat rushing to his left cheek, the remains of a warehouse still burning there. He dashed past a shell-ridden was, its headlights still shining dimly into the void, snatching scraps of camouflage netting and the bodies of those still asleep. His legs felt like lead, every step pounded his temples, but his GRU training drove him forward. Don't stop. If you stop, you'll die. Ahead, at the very exit of the village, guttural cries and the clanking of rifles could be heard. 3 surviving militants blocked the narrow passage between 2 collapsed walls. They frantically swung their machine guns around, searching for whoever had reduced their base to ashes. Alexei froze around the corner of the building, feeling the cold steel of the Browning pistol stick to his bloodied palm. 3 bullets. 3 enemies. The mathematics of war, simple and merciless, like a schoolwork problem. Only the price of a mistake here isn't a bad grade, but rotting in a nameless pit. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the smell of soot and smoke, and abruptly rolled around the corner, firing almost without aiming, on instinct alone. The first shot, the turbaned figure fell backward, dropping his AFGHAN. The second, a bullet struck the chest of the one trying to raise his rifle. The third militant, maddened by fear, began firing in a fan, the bullets singing above the captain's head, knocking stone chips from the walls. Alexei pulled the trigger a third time. The dry recoil pushed his hand back, and the last barrier collapsed into dust. The path to the mountains was clear, but behind them, the roar of approaching helicopters could already be heard. The mercenaries had called for backup, and these choppers clearly weren't carrying the Red Cross. The captain plunged into the darkness of the gorge, knowing the hunt for him was only just beginning. The roar of the rotor blades cut through the night air, turning into a heavy, physically palpable pressure on his eardrums. Alexei pressed himself into a narrow crevice, covering himself with a dirty piece of tarpaulin he found along the way. 2 Gazelles, French helicopters often used by mercenaries, passed overhead, sweeping the slopes with powerful searchlights. Beams of light slid across the rocks just meters from his shelter, picking out every crevice, every protrusion from the darkness like the eyes of a bird of prey. The captain felt fever begin to rack his body. The wound on his forehead was crusted black, but his left shoulder was burning, probably nicked by shrapnel from the warehouse explosion. His mouth was so dry his tongue felt like a piece of dry skin. He understood. The helicopters would seal off the passes, and the infantry would begin the clearing from below. He had no communications, no ammunition, and worst of all, he had no guarantee that they wouldn't consider him a traitor at the Bagram base. The GRU didn't like survivors of such meat grinders without a single scratch on their machine guns. He pulled Seryoga's notebook from his inside pocket. His friend's blood had soaked the pages, gluing them together into a single mass of pain. Alexei ran his finger along the cover. "If not me, then who?" That pompous phrase from training now took on the bitter taste of a real choice. He could lie low and wait to die of thirst, or he could try to reach point zero, the old secret cache the colonel had told him about before the drop. It was madness, traversing territory controlled by 3 different gangs, but a ghost can't die twice. Alexei stood up, leaning on the cold stone, and took the first step towards the glaciers, where the air was cleaner, and the chances of survival were clearer than rock crystal. The mountain air at 4,000 meters became thin and stinging, like broken glass lodged in his lungs. Alexei moved along the very ridge, where the wind knocked him off his feet, but at least here he wasn't exposed to the thermal imagers of the helicopters scurrying through the narrow gorges below. Each exhalation escaped his chest as a gray cloud, immediately vanishing into the icy void. His consciousness began to fail. The rocks seemed like the figures of soldiers in camouflage suits, and the howling wind resembled the distant wail of his mother calling him to dinner in their old house outside Moscow. His shoulder was numb, his arm hung limply, tucked into the lapel of his jacket to keep it from dangling. The captain knew this symptom, the onset of an infection, his blood poisoned by the soot and dirt of the Afghan roads. He found a tiny cave sheltered by a cliff overhang and collapsed into it, feeling his consciousness drifting into a dark, oily abyss. He dreamed of Seryoga. He was sitting on a piece of armor, peeling an apple with a knife and laughing, squinting against the bright sun. "Listen, Myoka," he said, "just don't lose my notebook. My Tanya's address is in there, she'll be lost without me." Alexei shuddered and opened his eyes. A snow leopard sat before him, literally 3 meters away. The beast stared at the man with unblinking yellow eyes, reflecting all the ancient cruelty of these mountains. The captain froze, even stopped breathing. The GRU had trained them to kill people, but this predator was the master of this place where Alexei was merely an uninvited guest. For a few seconds, they exchanged glances to ghosts, one of flesh and fur, the other of pain and steel. The leopard growled lowly, baring its fangs, turned, and silently melted into the gray mist of the snowfall. It was a sign. The mountains hadn't yet decided whether to take him or let him go. Alexei forced himself to his feet, supporting himself with his good arm, and trudged on, leaving a trail of jagged, uneven tracks in the pristine snow. Snow fell in thick, heavy flakes, turning the world into a white wall. Alexei walked, clutching his numb hand to his chest, feeling his consciousness shrink to the size of a single step. His left shoulder no longer hurt, it burned with a steady, searing flame, sending a deadly heat throughout his body. The fever painted strange images before his eyes. Sometimes he seemed to be walking down the corridor of the headquarters in Tashkent. Sometimes it seemed as if the crunch of dry autumn leaves in Gorky Park was not snow, but the crunch of snow under his feet. He tripped over an icy boulder and collapsed into a snowdrift. The cold was gentle, beckoning him to stay, close his eyes, and no longer struggle with this endless height. But a piece of paper rustled in his pocket. Seryoga's notebook. This small book with the names of the living and the dead became his anchor. Alexei tightened the strap on his shoulder with his teeth, forcing himself to rise. The GRU commandment do or die had become his only instinct, displacing fear and even his very identity. Ahead, through the blizzard's haze, the outline of a man-made structure emerged. It wasn't a village or an outpost, a lonely cenotaph tower, built of rough stone, as ancient as the mountains themselves. At its foot, Alexei spotted what he was looking for. A cave entrance, blocked by rocks, marked with a barely visible scratch sign, a crossed-out diamond. Zero's secret cache. The captain crawled to the entrance, scraping his fingernails on the icy rocks, and collapsed inside. It smelled of old grease, dry alcohol, and the safety of human habitation. He groped for the box, ripped open the lid, and saw the dim glow of the treasured radio and the syringes of Promadol. Salvation was in his hands, but the soft click of a cocked trigger from the depths of the cave froze him in place. From the darkness, the barrel of an old burr stared at him, and above it, to mad, hate-blazing eyes of an old hermit. The old man resembled a living mummy, wrapped in the decayed rags of a British uniform from colonial times. His beard, matted and dirty, reached his waist, and the skin on his face resembled tan parchment. He didn't scream, didn't call for help. He simply held Alexei at gunpoint, his finger steady on the trigger. In this cave, on the edge of the inhabited world, time stood still, turning the former Soviet officer and this mountain ghost into two frozen statues. "One of our own," Alexei croaked, trying to raise his good arm, but it fell limply onto the medical chest. "Sharavi." GRU. The old man narrowed his eyes, and something akin to recognition, mingled with a deep, age-old sadness, flashed in his gaze. He slowly lowered the rifle barrel and muttered something in a dialect the captain couldn't understand, but the intonation wasn't hostile, more like a funeral eulogy. The hermit approached, enveloping Alexei in the scent of smoke and herbs, and with a sharp movement, tore the bloody shred of his jacket from his shoulder. Seeing the black, swollen wound, the old man merely clicked his tongue and dragged the wounded man deeper into the cave, toward a tiny fire barely flickering in the corner. There, among a pile of old iron and scraps of 10-year-old Soviet newspapers, Alexei saw something that made his heart clench. On the wall hung a faded poster of the 1980 Olympic Mishka, and next to it, a yellowed photograph of a young man in the uniform of the KGB border troops. The old man wasn't an enemy, he was the shadow of someone who had once also never returned from these mountains, a father or brother driven mad by loneliness, left here to guard the ashes of their past. While the hermit was grinding some roots in a mortar with sharp movements, Alexei felt for a syringe containing Promadol. The needle entered the muscle, and the gray haze of pain slowly began to recede, giving way to a heavy, cottony oblivion in which the mountains finally stopped demanding his blood. Sleep was as heavy as a tombstone. Alexei felt as if he were drowning in boiling tar, while black birds with the faces of his comrades circled above him. Promadol had taken the pain away, but instead filled his head with a viscous fog. When he opened his eyes, the cave smelled of burnt pine needles and something sharp, animal. An old man sat opposite him, throwing fragments of old army crates onto a tiny fire. In the flickering light of the flames, his face seemed carved from stone, and his eyes glowed with a strange, otherworldly knowledge. The captain tried to move his left arm. His shoulder was tightly bound with strips of dirty but dry canvas, beneath which he could feel the chill of herbal poultices. The fever receded, leaving behind a gnawing emptiness in his stomach and a leaden weakness. Alexei slowly sat up, leaning his back against the cold cave wall. He looked at the old man, who handed him a sooty mug of a bitter, scalding brew. "Why are you here, father?" Alexei asked quietly, knowing he wouldn't understand the language, but needing the sound of a human voice. The old man pointed to a photo of a border guard on the wall and uttered something guttural, touching his heart and then the ground beneath his feet. This gesture carried more meaning than the hourly reports from the political department. He had stayed here so as not to leave his dead son alone in these strange mountains. Alexei remembered the notebook in his pocket and felt a chill run down his spine. He, too, carried the weight of other people's lives, lives he couldn't simply abandon. The hermit suddenly froze, put a finger to his lips, and pointed to the cave ceiling. Outside, the dry whistle of helicopter blades could be heard above the whistling wind. The hunt resumed, and this time the gazelles flew low, literally licking the slopes with their spotlights. The sound of the blades bit into the granite vaults, causing fine dust to fall from the ceiling onto Alexei's shoulders. The old man instantly transformed. From a decrepit hermit, he became a wary beast. With a sharp movement, he blew out the tiny flame of the fire, plunging the cave into a stifling, smoke-scented darkness. In this silence, the captain's breath seemed like the rumble of an avalanche. A powerful searchlight beam blazed from outside, momentarily piercing the cave entrance with a blinding white sword. The light slid along the walls, snatching the Olympic Mishka and the yellowed photo of the border guard, and raced further down the slope. Alexei froze, clutching the Browning. There were no bullets in it, but the steel felt cool in his palm, restoring the last of his composure. A minute later, the roar began to fade, receding toward the pass. The old man moved almost right up to Alexei. His hand, dry and tough like a juniper root, rested on the captain's healthy shoulder. He pointed deeper into the cave, where a narrow, almost imperceptible gap was visible behind a pile of rocks. Alexei realized this was the back door, a path unknown to either the GRU maps or the mercenaries. The hermit handed him an old flashlight, wrapped in duct tape, and his burr rifle. There was no request in his eyes, only an order to leave and live for both of them. "Thank you, father," Alexei whispered, knowing he would never see this man again. He squeezed into the crevice, feeling the cold stone pressing against his chest. Ahead lay the complete darkness and unknown of the underground labyrinth, but behind him remained the man who had guarded the silence of the dead for 30 years so that one living man could return home. The captain began to make his way through the narrow passage, guided only by the scent of a fresh breeze that wafted faintly from the depths of the mountain. The encirclement was tightening, but now the GRU ghost had a goal that weighed more than his own life. The passage narrowed, turning into a stone vise. Alexei crawled on his stomach, scraping his elbows on the ice chips, his wounded shoulder pulsing with every breath. The air here was heavy, stale, smelling of damp limestone and centuries of oblivion. The flashlight in his fist trembled, revealing only rough vaults in the darkness that seemed about to close in, burying the last witness to the carnage in the gorge. At some point, the space expanded, and the captain smelled a sharp, incomparable odor, the smell of ozone and thunder. Climbing out of the breach, he found himself on a narrow ledge, literally hanging over the abyss. Below, a kilometer beneath his feet, lay the night plateau, streaked with the fiery dots of tracer bullets. Somewhere down there, a war was raging, but here, at a bird's-eye view, a deathly grandeur reigned. Alexei pressed himself against the cliff, feeling the wind trying to tear him off the edge. Far on the horizon, where the mountains met the sky, a green flare flared. Code anti-friendly. GRU special forces were landing troops to clear the sector he himself had just reduced to ashes. The captain's heart sank as he ran unsteadily. About 3 kilometers remained to the evacuation point, a vertical descent. But between him and the rescue helicopter stretched the open greenery of the foothills, now raked by the machine guns of mercenaries enraged by the loss of their base. He checked his old burr. The magazine held only 2 rounds, heavy, blunt-nosed ones, capable of stopping even an armored personnel carrier. Alexei began his descent, realizing that the shortest route home always led through the very center of hell. Descending the steep slope drained his remaining strength. Alexei clung to the roots of stunted bushes that tore themselves from the rocks with a dry, cracking sound. His fingers grew numb, turning into stiff hooks, and one thought blared in his head. Make it before dawn. When the first timid ray of sun touched the peaks, the captain was already at the foot of the mountain, in the thick, fragrant greenery. The air here was sticky and hot, filled with the chirping of cicadas and the heavy anticipation of an ambush. He moved like a shadow, rolling from tree to tree, clutching the old drill to his chest. Ahead, beyond the dense wall of bushes, he heard strange voices, calm, confident. Mercenaries. They weren't fussing, they were waiting. Alexei froze, blending into the gray bark of the tree. Through a gap in the foliage, he saw them, 4 professionals in full gear, armed with silenced rifles, blocking the only path to the plateau where our helicopter would land. They formed a triangle, perfectly covering the sectors. The captain knew that with 2 rounds in his old rifle, there was no chance of an open fight. But he had something that dollars couldn't buy: knowledge of this land, soaked in the blood of his men. He slowly pulled the empty shell casing he'd picked up in the cave from his pocket and threw it hard to the far right, into the dense bramble. The dry click of metal on stone caused the mercenaries to instantly turn their barrels in the direction of the noise. These were the seconds for which the GRU awarded medals or erected monuments. Alexei raised his burr, aiming for the back of the team leader's head, and smoothly squeezed the trigger, feeling the butt of the rifle habitually dig into his battered shoulder. The thunderous rumble of an old burr shattered the morning silence, echoing through the mountains. A .303 caliber bullet, heavy and merciless, pierced the mercenary's Kevlar helmet like a dry eggshell. The team leader collapsed without even a cry. The remaining three instantly scattered, opening a hail of fire into the bushes where death had come from, but Alexei was no longer there. He rolled behind a fallen elm tree trunk, feeling the adrenaline burn away the last of the pain. Dirt flew into his face, splinters dug into his skin, and bullets from modern rifles whizzed overhead with a sickening whistle. The captain froze, pressing the butt of his rifle to his cheek. He had only one bullet left, the last argument in his battle with fate. He saw two mercenaries begin to flank him, moving skillfully, in short dashes, covering each other with a thick lead curtain. A roar grew louder in the sky, heavy, familiar bass. A pair of 1001 A-24s emerged from behind the ridge, showering the slopes with unguided rockets. The ground rose in black fountains, showering the gunners with dust and smoke. Alexei realized this was his only chance. He rose, caught the silhouette of a mercenary in his crosshairs, already raising his grenade launcher, and fired. The recoil hit his wounded shoulder so hard that his vision went dark, but he saw the enemy's figure fold in half. Now he was empty. Absolutely empty. Out of ammo, out of strength, but with Seryoga's notebook pressed to his heart under the armor of his faded Afghan jacket. He rushed forward, through smoke and flames, towards the helicopter landing in the dust, which now seemed to him the only salvation in this entire damned universe. The dust kicked up by the T-24's blades clogged his lungs, turning the world into a continuous gray haze. Alexei ran, his legs numb, stumbling over shell casings and rock fragments. Machine gun fire erupted from the helicopter's open hatch. The gunner was covering his retreat, mowing down the greenery with short, vicious bursts. The captain saw the outstretched hands of the men in their helmets, their faces distorted by screams, but the roar of the engine drowned out all sound, leaving only the animalistic rhythm of his pulse in his temples. "Come on, brother! Jump!" His broken voice cut through the roar when Alexei was already a couple of meters from the vibrating side of the helicopter. He jumped, clinging to the cold metal floor with the last of his strength. Strong arms grabbed him by the straps of his torn vest and pulled him inside, into the interior of the helicopter, smelling of kerosene and gun oil. The helicopter immediately pitched sideways, avoiding return fire, and then rose sharply, pinning Alexei to the armor plates. He lay on his stomach, gasping for air, while machine gun belt snaked nearby. A young medic lieutenant clung to him, frantically cutting the bloody sleeve of his Afghan jacket with scissors. "He's alive! Look, company commander, he's alive!" The medic shouted, turning to the officer at the window. "From the Granite team. 1. Alexei slowly turned his head. Beyond the open hatch, the mountains rapidly diminished, turning into folds on a dirty tablecloth. The gorge where his men remained disappeared behind a veil of clouds. He felt Seryoga's blood-soaked notebook in his inside pocket and clutched it tightly in his fist. Tears that hadn't been there in the heat of battle now stung his eyes, mingling with the soot and dirt. He had survived, but the price of that survival was written on every page of this little book, which he was now obliged to deliver, even if it meant going through hell all over again. The group no longer existed, only a ghost remained, flying home in the steel belly of the helicopter. The helicopter touched down on the Bagram concrete at dusk, when the sky above the airfield had turned the alarming color of dried blood. Alexei emerged from the vehicle himself, pushing aside the medic's hand. He staggered along the runway, past shrouded aircraft and stacks of crates, and the officers he passed instinctively parted, seeing his empty, burnt-out gaze. To them, he was a ghost risen from hell, about whom headquarters had already compiled a dry casualty report. A week later, washed clean of Afghan dust, but with streaks of gray at his temples, he stood on the platform of a train station outside Moscow. The air here was different, damp, smelling of rotting leaves and approaching rain. In the pocket of his civilian jacket, which fit him like a stranger, lay that very notebook. Alexei found the address he needed in an old brick house, where geraniums bloomed on the windowsills. His heart, which hadn't faltered under the bullets of the ambush, was now pounding so hard it took his breath away. A young woman with tired eyes, in which a faint, agonizing hope still glimmered, opened the door. She looked at his metal bar, at the scar across his forehead, and understood everything without words. Alexei silently handed her Seryoga's notebook, still smelling of gunpowder and mountain wind. He didn't talk about heroism, about explosions, or how their platoon had died. He simply turned and walked away along the wet asphalt, feeling a quiet, heart-rending cry behind him, impossible to silence with any orders. His war had ended here, at this entrance, leaving in his soul only a cold, granite silence and the eternal memory of those who remained forever as shadows in the folds of the Hindu Kush.